9:45, it's the lightning talk, so I'll go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming. It's the last session of the last day. They moved us to this time slot, so I appreciate you all coming. I'm going to talk about how we use Jenkins Pipeline to accelerate the rate at which we could both bring new continuous delivery pipelines onto our projects, as well as shorten the time of those pipelines, and how we went through that process using Jenkins Pipeline over the last year and a half or so. I'm the senior DevOps architect at Aquilent. We're a small IT consulting firm in Maryland, and a lot of what you're going to see is my work at my former company. I joined Aquilent in July, so we were a large financial services firm, which I'm not supposed to use their name, but in Maryland, and so a lot of what you're going to see is the work that we've done with them, as well as some things we're doing at Aquilent as well. I've been using Jenkins and Hudson for many years, and I've worked with a lot of different companies and clients to implement DevOps principles and at scale where possible. And so, as I mentioned, I was an early adopter of Jenkins Pipeline. We heard about it. We were really looking to go to continuous delivery, and we had a fairly large Jenkins installation already, so it made sense to look at that. So, why did we choose Jenkins Pipeline? So when we decided to go to Jenkins to continuous delivery, that we looked at several different tools, and so some of the tools that we looked at Executors Labs, XL Release. We're a big AWS shop, so we looked at the AWS Code Pipeline, and we looked at, we had already had several people using the Jenkins build pipeline plugin, and so that really became probably our biggest competitor to deciding if we wanted to move to Jenkins Pipeline. When we looked at some of the other tools, there were several things that brought Jenkins Pipeline to the top. We knew we wanted to be able to script our pipelines, however that went. So a lot of these tools did have the capabilities to define a pipeline through maybe a JSON or something, but there weren't any that really integrated the actual code of the pipeline as the pipeline. In other words, it was typically a situation where you define the JSON, you can maybe run an import process or something. Whereas with Jenkins Pipeline, the groovy Jenkins file is the pipeline. Okay, so that was a big winning thing for us. We also faced the challenge that most of these other tools that we looked at still required a large build infrastructure. So you had to have some way to build it. So and most of them, of course, integrated with Jenkins, since it's really the premier CI tool. And so we still had to maintain our Jenkins infrastructure. There was no one that could support the scale of our builds besides Jenkins, so we knew we still needed Jenkins anyway. So with that, we ultimately narrowed that list down by doing a pretty extensive evaluation, and it came down to Jenkins build pipeline plugin, plus the Job DSL plugin, which probably some of you are familiar with, and Jenkins, and that would allow us to script our pipelines. But ultimately, we went to Jenkins Pipeline, the true Jenkins Pipeline, or Jenkins workflow at the time. I mentioned about the integrated Groovy definition, so we can define the logic right within the jobs. If we want to try catches based on certain errors that happen, we could do that. Like I said, we had a large Jenkins infrastructure. The pipeline is very extensible, and I'll talk about how we did some of that. Just with Jenkins has always been built on that, and the pipeline has continued that. Very important thing was the manual step execution, and so we've heard other questions. I've heard this in other sessions. People saying, "Well, how do we get other developers? Sure, maybe they want to have these automated pipelines, but how do we get ops and security to buy into this?" And this manual step LDAP with the LDAP permissions really helped us. And so, because we were still able to have manual steps that could only be executed, for example, deployment to production, that could only be done by certain people. And then we wanted a way to templatize it so that we could build these very fast once we got going. So we wanted to accelerate the pipeline development. So how do we do this using Jenkins Pipeline? So we used extensively the remote file loader plugin. And if you're not familiar with this, it basically allows you to grab a separate Jenkins file from another Git repository, and you can use that, and you can ingest those functions. So like I said, we use AWS a lot, and so we use AWS code deploy, for example, for our deployments. And so we wrote a bunch of functions that allowed us to interact with AWS code deploy, and so then I could just consume, basically think of like an include file. Okay, and that's what the remote file loader plugin. Now, Jenkins has been hard at work on this workflow CPS global libs, and they've had this for a while, but it didn't quite work for us in the beginning. But hopefully, this may even be able to make that even more easy to share functions across your different pipelines. But even bigger, one thing that we struggled with for a while, and I was pretty proud of the solution that we came to, was to be able to share the pipelines themselves. And so, really, a lot of our components fell into build an app. Let's say it was a Java Maven app, and then deploy it to it's a WAR file, deploy it to a Tomcat server in dev, and then do the same in QA, and then do the same in production, and maybe run some tests in between. So a lot of these fell into this same thing, and the only thing that changed was the Git repository that you pulled the code from, or perhaps a testing suite you were running. So I'm just going to show you very quickly. This is an example. This is one I'm using with Aquilent here, because my former company I don't have the code to show you a lot of, but this is a similar one that I built for Aquilent. In this case, we had several functions that used the AWS Lambda. So we want to build a Lambda function based on a Java jar file and pulled from Git. And so you can see this template. We just call it an AWS Lambda Java pipeline Jenkins file. So I can now use this Jenkins file in all the different Lambda apps that I build that are based on this Java pipeline and pull from the same Git repository. And so the way that you do this, you can do it in two ways. You can have parameters. You can specify parameters, just standard Jenkins parameters that you're familiar with, and you can inject those. But you can use those and parameterize your pipelines as I do here. But even more so, you can. In this case, I'm literally saying I can pull everything from the job name. So you can see I just define this env.job name. And so when I create these different Jenkins jobs, each of the Lambda functions that I'm writing has its own Jenkins pipeline. So I might have, if I have 5 Lambda functions that I want to be able to deploy, I'll have 5 Jenkins jobs. And so now I basically call those Jenkins jobs names with the name, so it might be, whatever, Lambda function 1, Lambda function 2, and I call my Jenkins job name Lambda function 1, Lambda function 2. And then I basically do some extraction here, some logic to create this env short job name. And then I use that in, for example, here's where I'm pulling from my Git repository. It's the same Git repo, but with now I have this env short name. Okay, so I'm basically saying, use this name that I've extracted and maybe did some manipulation, and then I look for that in my Git repository, and then I can do the same thing for my Lambda function. Here I'm actually deploying, if you're familiar with AWS Lambda at all, this is just calling it into our AWS account, and this is the function name. When I name the function name, the same thing. So as long as I have the same naming convention across my Git repository, my deployment environment, in this case it's a Lambda function, and my Jenkins job name, I can reuse this pipeline over and over again. And this really allowed us to move much faster with our, with our pipelines to create them. Okay. And there are other ways that you can do the @grab, and so you can include, for example, a jar file you may have in your pipeline, and you can have a shared library using that. And then CloudBees now has, they did not have this then, but they now have the enterprise pipeline job template. So this is another thing. This is pretty new that I've learned about this, but it's something to try out if you're using the CloudBees version. Also, I mentioned there were really 2 goals. So that was really focused on how do we accelerate the pipeline development. We have all these new jobs, new apps coming on. How can we create these pipelines fast? That's how we did that. But how can we actually shorten the pipelines? So this is sort of the next step of what do we do to bring down the runtime of these pipelines? We use certainly parallel executors, so obviously Jenkins Pipeline makes it very easy to run things in parallel. The Jenkins ECS Docker plugin. So we use the Amazon ECS, Elastic EC2 container service, which runs the Docker, basically runs Docker containers. And so now developers could control their own slaves so they could create their own Docker file. If you've been to some of the other sessions on Docker, you've seen how some other people have done this as well. But basically, this was huge. We didn't have to send in the request to our tools admin team. Now developers can create their own slave definitions. Nodes came up much faster. So you can see this is an example of one. Each of these, to go into dev, to go into QA, 5 minutes, 4 minutes. Each of these, and before, all of our slaves are running on EC2. And so they were taking, several minutes to come up. Now, once we moved to Docker, they came up near instantly, 10 seconds or so, and these Docker containers would come up. And because it was within Amazon ECS has auto-scaling built in, so it could simply, we didn't need to reserve this huge cluster of Docker containers. It would scale up if we had a lot of builds running at that time. We knew that workspaces were always clean, and so the AWS auto-scaling worked. And so finally, just some observations quickly. So we did struggle. At first, there was very limited plugin support. Now they've expanded the number of plugins that integrate with pipelines. So if you're scared there isn't a plugin, pipeline for plugin, pretty much they're recommending that all new plugins be compatible with pipeline or anything that you're continuing to be integrated with pipeline. So we've had a lot more now that are. So we did have some basic capabilities that did not exist in Jenkins Pipeline that did in kind of traditional Jenkins. So view the workspace contents, we couldn't just do that. You couldn't see that because, of course, your workspaces are dynamic. We couldn't just rebuild, we lost the rebuild button. The Maven job support, we lost some of that. You have to kind of do that through shell scripts now. But anyway, it was all worth it because just the flexibility of some of the things that I've shown really put that over the edge. We also collected a lot of metrics on our builds that now had to be reworked a little bit for pipeline, but pipeline's APIs expose a lot of that too. So once you start creating these, if you try to do this at several components, you will quickly realize why pipelines scale so well, and you'll appreciate the benefits very quickly. It took me, a month or two to do this. Once I did, you really start seeing the benefits. And then, of course, as you've been here for a few days now, you see the pipeline is really the direction going forward, so they're going to continue to enhance it. So that's it. I'll stay around for some questions after, but I think we've got a couple more sessions here. Thanks.